Welcome to Midnight Affair Tales, where every story takes you on an unforgettable journey. So, let's dive into today's story. Have you ever felt the sting of betrayal so deep it left you questioning your own reality? The kind of pain that creeps into every corner of your life and turns love into heartbreak, trust into suspicion, and certainty into chaos? If you've been there, or even if you fear it, let us know where you're watching from. Today you'll hear a story about betrayal that didn't just shatter a man's life but led him to take revenge so ultimate, so final, it left everyone speechless. Meet Ethan Parker, a 35-year-old software engineer living in the bustling heart of San Francisco. Ethan wasn't just successful, he was admired. Colleagues envied his calm leadership, neighbors marveled at his sleek modern home perched on a hill, and friends saw him as the cornerstone of his social circle. Most of all, he had Olivia, his stunning wife, a marketing executive with charm to spare. Together they were a power couple, or so it seemed. But perfection, as Ethan would soon learn, is often just an illusion. On a chilly Tuesday evening, Ethan's day began like any other. He returned home, prepped a dinner of Olivia's favorites, seared salmon and her favorite Pinot Noir, expecting her cheerful arrival. But as hours slipped by and the once hot food turned cold, Ethan's mood shifted from concern to confusion, then dread. His calls went to voicemail. His texts were marked as read but went unanswered. Olivia was always busy, but this silence? This was different. As the clock struck midnight, Ethan stood alone in the dimly lit kitchen. His mind raced. Where was she? A flicker of doubt sparked. Was this just a late night at work or something far worse? He recalled subtle changes. Her laughter, once genuine, now forced. The scent of a cologne not his lingering faintly on her scarf. The signs were there, but denial had kept them at bay. That night, as Ethan stared out at the glowing city skyline, his perfect life felt like a cruel joke. Little did he know this was only the beginning. What followed was not just a revelation but an unraveling. A descent into a truth so dark it would ignite a fire in Ethan that couldn't be extinguished. Stay with us as we reveal how Ethan turned betrayal into vengeance, in a story that will leave you questioning the boundaries of love, trust, and revenge. The house was suffocatingly quiet, the kind of silence that amplified every creak, every sigh of the wind outside. Ethan Parker sat on the edge of his king-sized bed, his foot tapping anxiously against the hardwood floor. The soft, ambient glow from the bedside lamp cast long shadows, exaggerating the emptiness around him. His gaze flicked to the clock on the nightstand. 12:03 a.m. Olivia was late, again. Her pillow lay untouched, fluffed to perfection, mocking him with its pristine state. The faint trace of her perfume still lingered in the air, a floral sweetness that once comforted him but now felt like a cruel reminder of her absence. Ethan's phone sat dark on the nightstand, its screen bearing the weight of unanswered calls and ignored texts. He picked it up, scrolling through the messages he had sent her over the last few hours. Hey, are you okay? It's getting late, Olivia. Please call me. Where are you? All marked as read. None replied to. Ethan's stomach churned with a mixture of worry and frustration. He rose from the bed, running a hand through his dark hair. Pacing the room, he tried to think of a reasonable explanation. Maybe she's stuck at work. Maybe her phone died. But each excuse felt more hollow than the last. A nagging voice in the back of his mind whispered doubts he had been suppressing for weeks. The scent of cologne that wasn't his clinging to her scarf, the sudden work trips, the whispered phone calls she dismissed as nothing important. He had brushed them off, trusting her implicitly. Had he been blind? Grabbing his phone again, Ethan dialed her number, holding his breath as it rang. And rang. And rang. The familiar automated voicemail kicked in, and he hung up with a growl of frustration. Where the hell are you, Olivia? He muttered under his breath, his voice low and laced with anger. He walked to the window, staring out at the city skyline. The glow of streetlights and the distant hum of life felt like a world away. Inside this house, in this moment, he was alone. He glanced at the clock again, 12:28 a.m. Time seemed to stretch, each passing minute dragging him further into despair. The television flickered in the background, its muted dialogue providing no solace. Ethan tried to lose himself in the flashing images, flipping through channels aimlessly, but nothing could distract him from the gnawing anxiety in his chest. Then at 12:37 a.m. his phone buzzed. His heart leapt as Olivia's name flashed on the screen. Relief washed over him, quickly replaced by a simmering anger. He answered immediately. "Olivia? Where are you?" he demanded, his voice tight, struggling to stay calm. On the other end he heard a muffled giggle, followed by a slurred, almost sing-song response. "Relax, Ethan. I'm out with friends." Her words were slow, drawn out, and soaked in alcohol. Ethan's grip on the phone tightened. "Friends? At this hour? You could have at least called," he snapped, his concern now boiling over into frustration. In the background, faint but unmistakable, came the sound of a man's laughter, low, smug, and all too familiar. Ethan's blood ran cold. "Who's that?" he asked, his voice dropping to a dangerous calm. "Oh, it's just Jake," Olivia replied, her tone light, almost dismissive. "You know Jake, right?" Jake. The name landed like a punch to the gut. Jake was his coworker, his friend, or so he had thought. Memories of Jake's easy charm, his lingering handshakes with Olivia, and his too frequent jokes about borrowing her for a date flooded Ethan's mind. A storm of emotions, rage, betrayal, disbelief, roared inside him. "What are you doing with Jake at this hour?" he demanded, his voice trembling despite his effort to stay composed. "Oh, come on, Ethan. Don't be so dramatic," Olivia slurred. "We're just having a little fun. You should try it sometime." In the background, Jake's laughter grew louder, mocking. Ethan's chest tightened as he struggled to breathe. This wasn't just a suspicion anymore, it was confirmation. Every denial he had clung to, every excuse he had made for her, shattered in that moment. "Olivia," he said quietly, his voice eerily calm. "Come home. Now." She let out a laugh, sharp, cruel, and utterly foreign. "I'll come home when I feel like it. Don't wait up, Ethan." The line went dead. For a moment Ethan simply stood there, the phone still pressed to his ear, the silence on the other end deafening. Slowly he lowered it, staring at the screen as if willing her to call back. But she didn't. She wouldn't. The phone slipped from his hand, landing with a soft thud on the carpet. Ethan sank onto the edge of the bed, his body heavy with the weight of realization. The woman he loved, the life they had built together, the trust he had placed in her, it was all gone. He replayed the conversation in his head, each word a dagger carving deeper into his heart. Olivia's drunken giggles, Jake's smug laughter, they echoed in his mind like a cruel symphony. His hands clenched into fists as anger bubbled to the surface, burning away the numbness. For weeks he had ignored the signs. He had told himself she was busy, stressed, that he was overthinking. But now there was no denying it. The betrayal was real, raw, and inescapable. Ethan stared at the empty side of the bed, the neatly arranged pillow taunting him. 1,000 thoughts raced through his mind, each more painful than the last. How long had this been going on? How many times had Jake been in her ear, laughing at Ethan's expense? As the hours dragged on, the first light of dawn crept through the curtains, bathing the room in a pale, cold glow. Ethan hadn't moved. He sat in the same spot, staring blankly ahead, his mind a whirlwind of emotions. But somewhere amidst the chaos something shifted. The despair that had threatened to swallow him whole began to harden into something else. Something darker. He wouldn't let them get away with this. Not Jake. Not Olivia. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Ethan sat motionless, his mind no longer consumed by despair but focused on a single, unrelenting thought: revenge. And this wouldn't just be any revenge. It would be the ultimate reckoning. Ethan woke the next morning to the sharp chime of the doorbell reverberating through the house. It pulled him out of a restless sleep that had been plagued by fragmented memories of Olivia's laughter and Jake's smug voice. His body felt heavy, his mind still clouded by the aftermath of the previous night's revelations. Dragging himself out of bed, he moved toward the door, his steps slow and deliberate. When he opened it, his elderly neighbor, Mrs. Davidson, stood on the doorstep. A petite woman with a kind face, she was usually cheerful and talkative. Today, however, something was different. Her eyes, framed by her silver hair, avoided his, and her fingers clutched her purse strapped tightly, betraying her unease. "Mrs. Davidson," Ethan greeted, his voice hoarse, still rough from the emotional toll of the night. He studied her, noting the nervous way she shifted on her feet. This wasn't just a casual visit. "Everything okay?" She hesitated, glancing toward the quiet street before meeting his gaze. "Ethan dear, "I need to talk to you," she said, her voice low and unsteady. "It's important?" Ethan frowned but stepped aside. "Of course. Come in." Mrs. Davidson walked into the living room, her usual confident stride replaced with hesitant, measured steps. She perched on the edge of the couch, her posture rigid. Ethan sat across from her, his heart pounding in his chest. Something about her demeanor made his stomach churn. "What's going on?" he asked, leaning forward, his tone cautious but firm. Mrs. Davidson wrung her hands, her gaze darting around the room. "I've been debating whether or not to say anything," she began, her voice tinged with guilt. "I don't want to interfere in things that don't concern me, but I can't stay silent anymore." Ethan's pulse quickened. "What do you mean?" She swallowed hard, her fingers twisting together. "I saw something last week. Something that didn't sit right with me. And I think you deserve to know." The air in the room grew heavier, the walls seeming to close in. "What did you see?" Ethan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Mrs. Davidson took a deep breath, as though steeling herself for what she was about to say. "It was late, around midnight. I couldn't sleep, so I was sitting by my window looking out at the street. That's when I saw her." She hesitated, her expression pained. "I saw Olivia being dropped off, but she wasn't alone." Ethan felt his chest tighten. He leaned back, gripping the arm of the chair. "Who was she with?" Her voice dropped to a whisper, as though speaking too loudly might make it worse. "Jake. He was driving. A black sedan. They parked right outside your house." The name hit Ethan like a slap. His breathing quickened, his thoughts spiraling. "And then?" Mrs. Davidson's eyes softened with sympathy. "They hugged Ethan. But it wasn't a friendly hug. It was intimate. I'm sorry to be the one to tell you this, but I thought you should know." Ethan's jaw clenched as her words sank in. He had suspected something was wrong, but hearing it from someone else brought a finality to his fears. The dam of denial he had built to protect himself came crashing down, leaving nothing but the raw, undeniable truth. I didn't mean to pry," Mrs. Davidson stammered, her face flushed with discomfort. "But they were right there in front of my window. When I saw her walk into the house like nothing had happened, I couldn't shake the feeling that you needed to know." Ethan stood abruptly, pacing the room. His fists were clenched and his jaw tightened with every word she spoke. "Thank you for telling me," he said after a moment, his voice cold and detached. Mrs. Davidson's face fell. "I'm so sorry, Ethan. You're such a kind soul. You don't deserve this." Ethan nodded stiffly, avoiding her gaze. "I appreciate you looking out for me, Mrs. Davidson." She hesitated before standing, placing a gentle hand on his arm. "If you ever need to talk, dear, I'm just next door." Ethan walked her to the door, watching her retreat down the driveway. As soon as the door clicked shut, he leaned against it, his breathing uneven. Her words echoed in his mind, each syllable like a knife twisting deeper into his chest. Not the way friends hug. The betrayal he had felt last night had been visceral, but this was confirmation, proof that he couldn't ignore. He wasn't paranoid. He wasn't imagining things. Olivia and Jake had been deceiving him right under his nose. Ethan moved to the kitchen, his hands trembling as he poured himself a glass of water. He stared at the rippling liquid, his reflection distorted by the motion. He didn't just feel betrayed, he felt humiliated. How long had this been going on? How many people had known and stayed silent? He slammed the glass onto the counter, the sound reverberating through the empty house. His disbelief began to morph into something darker, something colder. Standing there in the stillness of the kitchen, Ethan's mind raced. If Jake had been comfortable enough to park outside his house, this wasn't a one-time lapse in judgment. This was calculated. It was deliberate. And it wasn't just an affair, it was a second life. He made his way to his office, flipping on the light. The glow from the laptop screen illuminated his face as he powered it on, his hands hovering over the keyboard. He didn't know exactly what he was looking for, but he knew he wouldn't stop until he found it. His search began with the obvious: credit card statements. As he scrolled through months of transactions, his eyes caught on unfamiliar charges. Dinner reservations at restaurants he'd never been to, hotel bookings in the city on nights Olivia had claimed to be working late. His jaw tightened as the puzzle pieces began to fit together. She hadn't even bothered to cover her tracks. Next, he combed through her social media looking for anything he might have missed. Photos she'd posted during work trips, comments from Jake that now seemed far too familiar. Every detail added another layer to his growing anger. By the time Ethan closed the laptop, the sun was setting, casting a dim orange glow across the room. He sat back in his chair, staring blankly at the wall. His thoughts were no longer a whirlwind of confusion and pain, they were razor-sharp, focused. This wasn't just a betrayal of trust. It was an attack on his life, his dignity, and everything he had built. And Ethan Parker wasn't going to let them get away with it. As Ethan pieced together the timeline of their betrayal, the weight of it all settled into clarity. This wasn't a fleeting mistake, it was a calculated deception. And now, armed with the truth, Ethan felt the cold resolve of a man who would stop at nothing to make them pay. Ethan's mind was a battlefield as he sat in his office, the dull glow of his laptop screen casting sharp shadows across his face. The betrayal was no longer just a suspicion, it was a solid, cold reality, and he needed to act. But this wasn't the time for rage. If he wanted justice, if he wanted revenge, it had to be calculated, precise, and indisputable. Scrolling through his phone, he searched for someone who could help him dig deeper. That's when he remembered Andrea Reeves, a private investigator his co-worker had once hired during a messy divorce. A quick search brought up her contact and he dialed the number. Andrea Reeves Investigations, a calm, confident voice answered on the third ring. Andrea, this is Ethan Parker. I need your help, he said, his voice steady but clipped. Of course, Mr. Parker. What's the situation? Ethan hesitated for only a second. I believe my wife is cheating on me. I need proof, solid proof. There was a brief pause before Andrea replied. Understood. Let's meet and discuss the details. My office or yours? Here. I'd rather keep this private. Tomorrow at 9 a.m., she confirmed. The next morning, Andrea arrived promptly, a woman in her late 30s with sharp eyes and a demeanor that exuded professionalism. She was dressed in a tailored suit, her hair pulled back into a neat bun. Ethan motioned her into the living room, where a stack of bank statements, credit card bills, and Olivia's work schedules awaited on the coffee table. Andrea scanned the pile, nodding slightly. You've already done some homework, she noted, sitting across from him. I need answers, Ethan replied, his tone firm. This isn't just about her cheating. It's about how deep this betrayal runs. I need to know everything, where she's been, who she's been with, and for how long. Andrea leaned forward, her expression serious. I'll start with the basics, tracking her movements, documenting her interactions. But I'll need access to her phone records and any other accounts she uses. The more information you can provide, the quicker I can get results. Ethan nodded, sliding over a folder containing copies of Olivia's recent statements and their shared phone bill. I found these last night. There are charges I don't recognize, restaurants, hotels. Andrea flipped through the papers, her sharp gaze scanning every line. These will help, she said. Give me a week. I'll report back with what I find. The next few days were a blur for Ethan. While Andrea worked on gathering evidence, he continued his own investigation, fueled by a relentless drive for answers. He spent hours poring over their bank accounts, cross-referencing transactions with Olivia's supposed work trips. One entry stood out, a charge for a luxury hotel downtown on the same night Olivia had claimed to be at a business conference. His blood boiled as he imagined her there with Jake, laughing, drinking, sharing a bed that wasn't theirs. Ethan's hands clenched into fists. She didn't even try to hide it. That evening, Andrea called with her first update. Mr. Parker, I found something you'll want to see. Can I come by tomorrow morning? Come now, Ethan demanded. Andrea arrived within the hour, carrying a manila envelope. She placed it on the coffee table, her expression unreadable. This is just the beginning, she said, sliding the contents out. Photos spilled onto the table, Olivia and Jake in a dimly lit restaurant, their heads close together as they shared a laugh. Another showed them leaving the hotel Ethan had flagged, their hands brushing in a way that was anything but casual. Ethan stared at the images, his jaw tightening. How long have they been meeting? Based on the surveillance, at least a few months, Andrea replied. There's more. Receipts for meals, tickets to events they attended together, and, she pulled out a final photo, her voice lowering. This was taken 2 nights ago. The photo showed Jake's black sedan parked outside Ethan's house, Olivia leaning into the driver's side window, her face lit with a smile that once belonged to Ethan. His chest tightened as he stared at the image. He couldn't deny it any longer. She wasn't just cheating, she was mocking him, parading her betrayal in front of their neighbors, their friends. Andrea's voice broke through his thoughts. What do you want to do next? Ethan leaned back, his gaze cold and distant. Keep digging. I want everything, phone records, emails, anything that connects her to him. I need irrefutable proof. Andrea nodded. I'll keep you updated. As the days passed, Ethan's anger simmered beneath the surface, controlled but ever present. He began noticing patterns he had ignored before. The late nights, the sudden work emergencies, the way Olivia's demeanor shifted when Jake's name came up in conversation. One evening, he confronted her indirectly, testing the waters. How was work? He asked as they sat down to dinner. Busy, Olivia replied, not meeting his eyes. Still spending a lot of time with Jake? She froze for a fraction of a second before recovering, laughing lightly. Jake? He's just a coworker, Ethan. Don't be ridiculous. Ethan forced a smile, his knuckles whitening as he gripped his fork. Of course. Inside he seethed. The lies came so easily to her, so effortlessly. A week later, Andrea returned with a full report. She laid out everything on the dining table. Photos, receipts, emails Jake and Olivia had exchanged. Ethan flipped through the documents, his anger growing with each page. One email caught his eye. It was from Olivia to Jake, sent 2 months ago. I can't wait until this is over. Once everything is finalized, we can be together without hiding. Ethan's stomach churned. Finalized? What does she mean? Andrea hesitated. She's been meeting with a divorce attorney. She hasn't filed yet, but it's only a matter of time. She's planning to take a significant portion of your assets, including your share in the company. The room spun as Ethan processed her words. Not only was Olivia cheating on him, but she was plotting to dismantle his entire life. He closed the folder, his hands trembling with a mix of fury and determination. Thank you, Andrea. Your work is done for now. Andrea nodded, her gaze steady. If you need anything else, let me know. After she left, Ethan sat alone in the dimly lit dining room, the evidence spread before him like the pieces of a puzzle. He had everything he needed to confront Olivia, to expose her lies and destroy the illusion she had so carefully crafted. But as he stared at the damning photos and documents, a new thought emerged. Confrontation would be too easy, too quick. She and Jake didn't deserve the luxury of a single explosive argument. They deserved to feel what he felt: betrayal, humiliation, loss. Ethan closed the folder and leaned back, his mind racing with plans. He had enough to confront Olivia, but he wouldn't. Not yet. This betrayal demanded more than anger, it demanded justice, and Ethan was prepared to play the long game. The days that followed Andrea's revelations were a blur of quiet agony and simmering rage for Ethan. Each morning, he woke to the grim reality that his wife's betrayal was no longer a suspicion. It was a cold, unyielding truth. Yet he knew he had to maintain a facade. To confront Olivia too soon would only rob him of the opportunity to fully expose her duplicity. Olivia, unaware that her lies were unraveling, had grown increasingly careless. Her once thoughtful excuses now felt hastily constructed, almost as if she believed Ethan had grown complacent or oblivious. One evening, as they sat at the dinner table, Ethan decided to test her resolve. The tension between them hung heavy in the air, yet Olivia seemed unnerved, scrolling through her phone as if everything were normal. Busy day at work? Ethan asked, his tone deceptively casual as he speared a piece of roasted chicken. Olivia didn't look up. Always. Meetings back to back. I barely had time to breathe. Ethan nodded, hiding the tightness in his jaw. Still working closely with Jake, I assume? Her fork paused midair for just a moment, so brief that anyone else might have missed it. But Ethan noticed. She laughed lightly, recovering quickly. Jake? He's just a coworker, Ethan. You know how these things go. The ease with which the lie slipped from her lips was like a slap to Ethan's face. He forced a smile, his knuckles whitening under the table as he clenched his fists. Of course, he said, his voice even, though the storm inside him raged on. Later that evening, Olivia claimed she had to work late on an urgent project. She kissed Ethan's cheek in passing, a gesture that once might have reassured him but now felt hollow. As soon as she left, Ethan pulled out his phone, dialing Andrea. She's on the move, he said, his voice low. Andrea, ever efficient, was already in position. I got her covered. Let me handle it. Hours later, Andrea sent Ethan a message. "Meet me in the morning. You'll want to see this." The next day, Andrea arrived with another envelope of evidence, her expression grim. She spread the photos across Ethan's dining table, each one a damning snapshot of Olivia's betrayal. "This was last night," Andrea said, pointing to a series of images. One showed Olivia and Jake sitting in a dimly lit bar, their heads close together as they laughed. Another captured them leaving hand in hand, Jake's smirk unmistakable. Ethan's eyes burned as he stared at the photos. "She didn't even try to hide it," he muttered. "It gets worse," Andrea said, pulling out a stack of receipts. "This one is for a weekend at the Rosewood Hotel 2 months ago. She booked it under her name but paid with a credit card linked to Jake's account. And this," she slid over a copy of an email. Ethan's breath hitched as he read it. _ from Olivia Parker. To Jake Harrington. Subject, almost there. I can't wait until this is behind us. Once the paperwork is finalized, we'll finally be free to start our life together. No more hiding _ He gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles turning white. Finalized? What does she mean? Andrea hesitated. She's been consulting a divorce attorney, Ethan. She hasn't filed yet, but based on what I've uncovered, she's planning to go after half of your assets, including your share of the firm. Ethan's world tilted. The room felt smaller, the air heavier. Not only had Olivia betrayed him emotionally, but she was plotting to dismantle his career, his stability, his entire life. "Does Jake know about this?" he asked, his voice cold. Andrea nodded. "He's been actively involved. They're working together to ensure the split leaves you with as little as possible." Ethan stared at the evidence before him, the photos and documents blurring as his mind raced. Every detail, every lie, every calculated move by Olivia and Jake came together like pieces of a sinister puzzle. As the days passed, Ethan began noticing more cracks in Olivia's facade. Her excuses grew sloppier, her lies more transparent. One evening, she claimed she was going to the gym but returned hours later with her hair styled and the faint scent of Jake's cologne clinging to her clothes. "You were at the gym?" Ethan asked as she walked through the door. "Yes," she said without missing a beat, dropping her bag by the stairs. "Why?" "No reason," Ethan replied, masking the bitterness in his voice. At social gatherings, the tension became palpable. Ethan noticed the way their mutual friends avoided meeting his eyes or quickly changed the subject when Jake's name came up. Once, during a dinner party, a colleague of Olivia's accidentally let slip about a weekend work retreat that Ethan knew nothing about. The room fell silent as Olivia shot the colleague a sharp look, laughing it off as a scheduling mix-up. Ethan played along, but inside, his anger simmered. Every careless word, every suspicious glance, every slip in Olivia's carefully crafted narrative only fueled his determination. A week later, Andrea delivered the final piece of the puzzle. "I accessed her attorney's records," Andrea said, sliding a folder across the table. "She's drafted the divorce papers. She hasn't filed yet, but it's only a matter of time. The terms are heavily skewed in her favor, half of your assets including the firm. Jake is listed as her financial advisor." Ethan flipped through the documents, his chest tightening with every line. The betrayal was no longer just personal, it was an assault on everything he had worked for. Olivia wasn't just leaving him, she was trying to destroy him. Andrea's voice softened. "What do you want to do, Ethan?" Ethan closed the folder, his hands steady despite the storm inside him. "Not yet," he said quietly. "I'm not ready to confront her. She thinks she's won, but she doesn't know what's coming." Andrea nodded, her respect for his composure evident. "Let me know when you're ready." That night, Ethan sat alone in his office, the evidence spread before him like the pieces of a war plan. Olivia's lies had unraveled, exposing the depth of her betrayal. But confronting her now would be too easy, too merciful. Ethan leaned back in his chair, his mind sharp and calculating. Olivia and Jake thought they had the upper hand, but they had underestimated him. This wasn't the end. It was just the beginning of his carefully plotted revenge. Ethan sat at his dining table, the quiet hum of the city outside barely registering as he stared at the scattered pieces of evidence Andrea had left behind. Jake's betrayal ran deeper than Ethan had imagined, but he now understood that this wasn't just his fight. To dismantle Jake's twisted scheme, Ethan needed allies, people he trusted who had as much at stake as he did. It began with a knock on his door late one evening. Ethan wasn't expecting anyone, but as he opened the door, he was met with the disheveled figure of his younger brother, Tommy. Ethan blinked in surprise, unsure of what to make of the sight before him. "Tommy," Ethan said, his voice cautious. "It's late. What's going on?" Tommy shifted uncomfortably, his hands stuffed deep into his jacket pockets. His once vibrant face now bore the marks of sleepless nights and battles with addiction. I needed to talk to you," he stammered, his voice thick with guilt. Ethan studied him for a moment before stepping aside. "Come in." Tommy shuffled into the living room, pacing nervously as Ethan followed. His brother looked smaller, as though the weight of his choices had physically diminished him. "Ethan, I need to tell you something," Tommy began, stopping abruptly to face him. "Something I should have told you a long time ago." Ethan folded his arms, his tone guarded. "What is it, Tommy?" Tommy took a deep breath, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "It's Jake. He's the reason I've been in such a mess. He's been loaning me money, encouraging me to keep using, and—" His voice broke as he looked away. "He told me you hated me. Said I was nothing but a burden to you." Ethan's heart twisted painfully. "What? Why would he do that?" Tommy collapsed onto the couch, burying his face in his hands. "He said I was your weakness. That I'd ruin your reputation if people knew the truth about me. He kept me hooked so he could control me, and use me to get to you." Ethan clenched his fists, his anger simmering just below the surface. "That son of a—" He stopped himself, exhaling slowly. "Why didn't you come to me sooner?" "I was scared," Tommy admitted, his voice trembling. "I thought he was right that you didn't want me around. But I can see now. I've been a pawn in his game." Ethan sat beside his brother, placing a firm hand on his shoulder. "You're not a pawn, Tommy. You're my brother. And we're going to fix this. Together." The next call Ethan made was to his older sister, Rachel. She had always been the sharpest in the family, her career as a lawyer making her a force to be reckoned with. When he laid out what he knew about Jake, Rachel didn't hesitate to get involved. "Jake Harrington," she mused, leaning back in her chair as they sat in Ethan's office. "I've heard that name before. One of my clients mentioned him a while back. Something about shady real estate deals." Ethan's ears perked up. "Shady how?" Rachel tapped her fingers on the desk, her expression thoughtful. "Fraud. Kickbacks. Forged documents. If he's involved in what I think he is, he's not just a cheater. He's a criminal. Can you find out more?" Ethan asked, his voice steady but laced with urgency. Rachel smirked, a glint of determination in her eyes. "Give me a day." True to her word, Rachel called Ethan the next evening, her tone grim. "I dug into Jake's real estate ventures. It's worse than I thought, Ethan. He's running a full-blown scam, falsifying property values, evicting tenants under false pretenses, and pocketing the profits." Ethan's stomach churned. "Does Olivia know about this?" "She might," Rachel replied. "But here's the kicker. He's using her to launder money. She's listed as a silent partner in 2 of his shell companies. If this goes public, it could ruin her too." Ethan sat back, processing her words. "Anything else?" Rachel hesitated before continuing. "I also looked into that car accident I had last year, the one I thought was just bad luck. Turns out it wasn't." Ethan leaned forward, his heart pounding. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying Jake orchestrated it," Rachel said, her voice cold. "He wanted to scare me off a case I was working on. One of his business partners was involved and they needed me out of the way." The revelation hit Ethan like a freight train. His hands shook with anger as he gritted his teeth. "He put your life in danger?" "Yes," Rachel said firmly. "And I have the evidence to prove it." As the pieces of Jake's treachery came together, Ethan realized just how deeply the man had infiltrated his life. Jake wasn't just an unfaithful friend. He was a predator, exploiting everyone in Ethan's orbit for his own gain. Ethan called a meeting with Tommy and Rachel, determined to unite his family against their common enemy. They gathered in his office, the tension in the room palpable as Ethan laid out the evidence. "Jake's been playing all of us," Ethan began, his voice steady but filled with quiet fury. "He's used Tommy to manipulate me, tried to destroy Rachel's career, and now he's coming for everything I've built. This isn't just personal, it's war." Tommy looked down, his hands clenched into fists. "I let him control me, Ethan. But not anymore. I'll do whatever it takes to make this right." Rachel crossed her arms, her expression fierce. He messed with the wrong family. I've already started drafting the paperwork to expose his fraudulent business dealings. If we play this right, we can take him down on all fronts." Ethan nodded, a spark of determination igniting within him. Good. He thinks he's untouchable, but he's about to learn otherwise. The three siblings sat together, strategizing late into the night. For the first time in years, Ethan felt a renewed sense of purpose. Jake might have underestimated them individually, but as a family, they were a force to be reckoned with. As Ethan looked at Tommy and Rachel, he felt a surge of hope. Jake's betrayal had gone far beyond the affair. It was an attack on everything Ethan held dear. But now, with his family united, Ethan knew they had the strength to fight back. The war was just beginning. Ethan sat in his dimly lit office, the weight of the past weeks pressing heavily on his chest. The evidence Andrea had uncovered sat in neat piles on his desk, damning Olivia and Jake at every turn. But Ethan wasn't ready to confront them directly. Not yet. Instead, he began orchestrating a plan, one that would tear apart the carefully constructed web of lies they had spun around him. The first step was exposing Olivia's betrayal to Jake's allies. Ethan wasn't just going after their relationship, he was going after their trust. If he could create chaos in their inner circle, it would push them into panic and force their carefully hidden secrets to surface. Using an encrypted email address, Ethan anonymously sent select pieces of evidence to Jake's closest business associates. The photos of Olivia and Jake, the receipts from their secret getaways, and snippets of Jake's fraudulent dealings were sent with one simple message. "Do you know who you're working with?" The fallout was immediate. Within days, Ethan began hearing whispers through the grapevine. Jake's business partners were pulling out of deals, questioning his integrity and demanding explanations. Ethan knew he was striking a nerve when Olivia came home one evening visibly shaken. "Ethan," she said, dropping her purse on the counter. "Work's been intense lately. I don't know what's going on, but Jake's been under a lot of pressure. People are accusing him of things he didn't do." Ethan suppressed a smirk, his tone carefully neutral. "Really? That's surprising. Jake always seemed like he had everything under control." Olivia sighed, her hands trembling slightly as she poured herself a glass of wine. "Yeah, well, everyone's ganging up on him now. He's been so stressed. He's even talking about moving some of his accounts offshore just in case." Ethan filed that away for later. If Jake was desperate enough to hide money, it meant the walls were closing in on him. Meanwhile, Jake's temper was beginning to fray. His normally smooth demeanor had given way to bursts of anger and paranoia. Andrea's surveillance revealed him lashing out at his employees, accusing them of leaking information. "Who the hell is doing this?" Jake barked during a heated phone call, the audio captured by Andrea's team. "I don't care what it takes. Find out who's sabotaging me." His desperation was palpable. Ethan knew he was playing the long game perfectly. One evening, Andrea delivered an update that sent Ethan's plan into overdrive. "Jake's been shifting large sums of money into offshore accounts," she said, placing a folder on the desk. "He's panicking. This is the kind of movement that raises red flags, and if we act fast, we can tie it directly to his fraudulent activities." Ethan leaned back in his chair, a cold smile spreading across his face. "Perfect. Let's keep the pressure on." At the same time, Ethan began subtly planting doubts in Olivia's mind about Jake. He left innocuous comments during their conversations, designed to chip away at her trust. "Olivia," he said one evening as they sat watching TV, "you've been spending a lot of time with Jake lately. Are you sure you can trust him? He's under a lot of scrutiny right now. People do desperate things when they're cornered." Olivia stiffened but quickly recovered. "Of course I trust him. Jake's been nothing but loyal to me." Ethan nodded, hiding his satisfaction. "Just be careful. Sometimes the people closest to us are the ones we should watch the most." As Jake's world unraveled, Olivia began to show cracks in her carefully composed facade. One morning, Ethan noticed her standing in the kitchen, staring blankly at her phone. "Everything okay?" he asked, feigning concern. She jumped slightly, her grip tightening on the phone. "Yeah. Just work stuff." Ethan's eyes flicked to the screen, catching a glimpse of a heated text exchange between her and Jake. He didn't press, letting the silence between them grow heavy. That evening, Olivia's panic became more evident. She was pacing the living room, her phone clutched tightly in her hand as she argued with Jake. "I told you to handle this," she hissed into the phone. People are asking questions, Jake. They're digging into everything. If this gets out, she stopped abruptly, glancing at Ethan, who pretended to be engrossed in his book. Lowering her voice, she continued, "We need to figure this out. Now." Ethan watched her out of the corner of his eye, his heart pounding with satisfaction. Olivia was unraveling and Jake wasn't far behind. As the days turned into weeks, Jake's desperation escalated. Andrea reported that Jake had been meeting with shady associates, likely attempting to cover his tracks. His once flawless reputation was in tatters, his confidence shaken. Ethan's final move came in the form of a leaked document to the press. It was an anonymous tip exposing one of Jake's largest fraudulent deals. The story spread like wildfire, dragging Jake's name through the mud. That evening, Olivia returned home pale and trembling. "Ethan, have you seen the news?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "About Jake?" Ethan said, feigning surprise. "Yeah, I saw. It's shocking, isn't it?" She sank into the couch, burying her face in her hands. "I don't understand how this happened. He's always been so careful." Ethan sat beside her, placing a hand on her shoulder. "Sometimes people aren't who we think they are, Olivia. Maybe it's time to reevaluate who you trust." As Jake sat in his office, staring at the headlines that branded him a fraud, he felt the weight of his crumbling empire pressing down on him. He clenched his fists, his mind racing with paranoia. Someone was sabotaging him, systematically dismantling everything he had built. But who? What Jake didn't realize was that the man he had betrayed, the man he thought was broken, was the very one orchestrating his downfall. Ethan Parker was no longer a victim. He was the force pulling the strings, and the game was far from over. Ethan leaned back in his chair, the glow of his laptop illuminating the cold smile on his face. The pieces were finally falling into place. Over the past few weeks, Jake's empire had begun to crumble under the weight of strategic leaks and mounting pressure. But this next step, the final trap, would ensure Jake's complete downfall. Ethan's plan was meticulous, and he wasn't alone in executing it. Andrea sat across from him, a tablet in her hands. "I've planted the evidence where it will hurt the most," she said, scrolling through the files. "The offshore accounts, the fake property valuations, the bribes, everything is ready to be handed over to the authorities. Cameron's working on encrypting the files so they can't be traced back to us." Cameron, a tech-savvy hacker Andrea had brought onto the team, was the last piece of Ethan's arsenal. A recluse with a talent for finding and exposing secrets, Cameron had already dug deep into Jake's financial dealings, uncovering a web of illegal activities that would make headlines for weeks. "Jake doesn't know what's coming," Cameron said through a video call, his voice calm but laced with amusement. "By the time he realizes, his accounts will be frozen, his partners will abandon him, and the authorities will be knocking on his door." Ethan nodded. "Good. Make sure every detail is airtight. I want no room for him to wiggle out of this." That evening, Andrea and Cameron executed the first phase of the trap. Cameron hacked into Jake's accounts, planting records that pointed to massive embezzlement and fraud. He carefully backdated transactions, making them look like years of illegal activity Jake had orchestrated to fund his lavish lifestyle. Simultaneously, Andrea arranged for the evidence to reach two key players: a high-ranking official in the Internal Revenue Service and a prominent investigative journalist with a reputation for taking down corrupt businessmen. Both received anonymous tips with detailed files that painted Jake as the mastermind of a multimillion-dollar scam. As they worked, Olivia began to sense that something was off. She had grown increasingly distant from Jake, their once cozy affair now strained under the weight of his paranoia and temper. Ethan had noticed the shift and decided to exploit it. One evening, as Olivia sat on the couch scrolling through her phone, Ethan approached her, feigning casual concern. "You seem distracted," he said, sitting beside her. "Is everything okay?" Olivia hesitated, her fingers tightening around her phone. "Just work stuff. Jake's been difficult lately." Ethan raised an eyebrow, keeping his tone neutral. "Difficult how?" She sighed, leaning back against the couch. "He's been so paranoid. He's constantly looking over his shoulder, snapping at everyone. It's like he thinks someone's out to get him." Ethan tilted his head, pretending to ponder her words. "Well, considering all the rumors about his business dealings, maybe he has a reason to be paranoid." Olivia frowned, her eyes narrowing slightly. "What rumors?" "Oh, just things I've overheard. Ethan replied, waving a hand dismissively. You know how people talk. But if I were you, I'd be careful. Sometimes the people closest to us are the ones hiding the most. His words planted a seed of doubt that began to grow in Olivia's mind. Over the next few days, she found herself scrutinizing Jake more closely. The turning point came when Olivia stumbled across something she wasn't meant to see. One night, while Jake was in the shower, she noticed his laptop sitting open on the dining table. A notification popped up, drawing her attention. She hesitated for a moment before curiosity got the better of her. What she found sent a chill down her spine. Hidden folders filled with videos of her. Jake had been recording their private moments without her consent. Her hands trembled as she clicked through the files, the reality of Jake's betrayal sinking in. He hadn't just used her as a pawn in his schemes. He had violated her trust in the most personal way. When Jake emerged from the shower, he found Olivia standing by the table, her face pale and her eyes blazing with anger. "What the hell is this?" she demanded, pointing at the laptop. Jake froze, his expression shifting from surprise to annoyance. "Olivia, calm down. It's not what you think." "Not what I think," she shouted, her voice shaking. "You've been recording me without my knowledge, without my consent. How could you do this?" Jake's frustration boiled over. "I did it to protect us. You don't understand what's at stake here." "No, Jake," Olivia snapped. "You did it to protect yourself. Everything has always been about you." Meanwhile, Cameron was putting the final touches on the digital trail that would seal Jake's fate. By the time Jake woke up the next morning, his offshore accounts were frozen, flagged by international banking authorities for suspicious activity. His phone was flooded with messages from furious business partners demanding explanations, and his email inbox was overflowing with legal threats. Ethan watched it all unfold from a distance, his satisfaction growing with each new update from Andrea and Cameron. The once arrogant man who had stolen his wife and tried to dismantle his life was now floundering, grasping at straws to salvage what was left of his crumbling empire. Jake's criminal associates, sensing the noose tightening, began to turn on him. One by one they cut ties, eager to save themselves from the fallout. The investigative journalist who had received the anonymous tip published a scathing exposé, detailing Jake's fraudulent schemes and naming him as the central figure in a wide-reaching conspiracy. Ethan could barely suppress his smile as Olivia read the article aloud at breakfast, her voice trembling with disbelief. This can't be true," she said, her eyes darting over the damning headlines. Ethan sipped his coffee, his expression carefully neutral. "Well, if it is, it looks like Jake's finally getting what he deserves." Jake sat in his once lavish office, the walls around him feeling smaller with every passing second. His accounts were frozen, his allies had abandoned him, and the authorities were closing in. He slammed his fist on the desk, his mind racing with paranoia. "Who did this to me?" he muttered, his voice a mix of rage and desperation. But as he racked his brain, one name never crossed his mind: Ethan Parker. Jake had underestimated him, dismissing him as a victim. Little did he know Ethan was the mastermind behind it all, and the game was far from over. Jake's penthouse was eerily quiet for the first time in weeks, but the silence did nothing to calm the storm raging within him. Papers were strewn across the floor, and the once pristine desk was now cluttered with empty coffee cups, discarded notes, and the remnants of Jake's unraveling composure. His phone buzzed incessantly, another incoming call from one of his panicked associates, but Jake ignored it. He was consumed by the realization that someone was systematically dismantling his empire. His paranoia had reached a fever pitch. Each message, every damning article in the press, and every betrayal from his business partners felt like a dagger to the back. He paced the room, muttering to himself as he pieced together what little he could. Suddenly, the penthouse was flooded with flashing red and blue lights. The sound of pounding on the front door broke the silence, followed by the unmistakable command. "Jake Harrington, this is the police. Open the door immediately." Jake froze, his heart hammering in his chest. The knocking grew louder, more insistent. "We have a warrant for your arrest. Open the door or we'll break it down." Panic gripped him. He bolted for the safe in the corner of the room, fumbling with the combination as beads of sweat dripped down his face. Just as he managed to yank it open, the door burst inward and armed officers stormed into the room. "Hands in the air. Now," one of the officers shouted, his weapon trained on Jake. Jake's trembling hands shot up, his mind racing as he tried to think of an explanation, an excuse, anything to talk his way out of this. "There's been a mistake," he shouted, his voice cracking. "I'm innocent. I didn't do anything." The officers ignored him, forcing him to the ground and securing his hands behind his back with cuffs. The room buzzed with activity as more officers filed in, confiscating files, electronics, and any potential evidence. Across the street, Ethan stood in the shadows of a nearby alley, watching the chaos unfold through the large windows of Jake's penthouse. A cold satisfaction settled over him as he saw the man who had stolen so much from him brought to his knees. He hadn't planned to witness Jake's arrest in person, but something had drawn him here, the need to see his enemy's downfall with his own eyes. He sipped his coffee, the warmth contrasting the chill of the evening air, and allowed himself a small, grim smile. From his vantage point, Ethan could see Olivia standing in the corner of the penthouse, her face pale as she watched the police tear through Jake's life. She clutched her phone tightly, her knuckles white, as if willing it to ring with a lifeline that would never come. Inside, Olivia's mind raced as she tried to process what was happening. The accusations against Jake had been mounting for weeks, but she had clung to the belief that he would find a way out, as he always did. Now, watching him dragged away in handcuffs, that illusion shattered. "Jake," she called out, her voice breaking. He turned his head toward her, his expression a mixture of fury and desperation. "Don't say anything to them. Call my lawyer," he shouted before being forced out the door by the officers. Left alone in the aftermath, Olivia felt the walls of the penthouse closing in on her. The officers barely spared her a glance as they continued their search, their movements efficient and methodical. She sank onto the couch, her hands trembling as she dialed Ethan's number. Ethan felt his phone buzz in his pocket. Pulling it out, he saw Olivia's name flash across the screen. For a moment he considered answering, but then he pressed the button to decline the call. This wasn't her story anymore, it was his. He slipped the phone back into his pocket, his gaze returning to the penthouse. He wasn't done yet. There were still pieces of Jake's empire left to dismantle, and Ethan intended to see it through to the end. Jake's journey to the police station was anything but dignified. Seated in the back of the squad car, he replayed the events of the past weeks, trying to pinpoint the moment everything had gone wrong. His mind darted from one possibility to the next, but the one person who should have been at the forefront of his thoughts never crossed his mind: Ethan Parker. By the time they arrived at the station, Jake's confidence had been completely eroded. The press was waiting outside, cameras flashing as reporters shouted questions. Jake lowered his head, his once pristine reputation now reduced to a tabloid scandal. Back at the penthouse, Olivia wandered through the wreckage of Jake's life, her thoughts a chaotic swirl. She couldn't ignore the growing realization that she had been nothing more than a pawn in Jake's schemes. The recordings she had found on his laptop now took on a darker significance, and she couldn't shake the feeling of violation. She dialed Ethan's number again, desperation creeping into her voice. "Ethan, please pick up," she whispered into the voicemail. "I need to talk to you. I don't know what's happening. I don't know what to do." The line went dead and Olivia sank onto the bed, tears streaming down her face. Across the city, Ethan returned to his home, closing the door behind him with a sense of finality. He poured himself a glass of scotch, staring out the window at the distant skyline. The battle had been long and grueling, but for the first time in weeks he felt a sense of peace. He didn't feel the need to respond to Olivia's calls. She had made her choices and now she was facing the consequences. Ethan wasn't interested in her excuses or her regrets. His focus was on the bigger picture, rebuilding his life and ensuring that Jake could never hurt anyone else again. As Ethan stood in the quiet of his home, his phone buzzed again, Olivia's name lighting up the screen. He let it ring, his resolve unwavering. This chapter of his life was closed and he wasn't looking back. Across the city, Jake sat in a holding cell, his mind consumed with thoughts of revenge. But he was too late. Ethan Parker had already won, and the final nail in Jake's coffin was yet to come. Jake Harrington's downfall was swift and brutal. The once respected businessman, with his polished reputation and seemingly untouchable status, now sat in a cold, sterile courtroom facing a slew of charges that left his lawyers scrambling for damage control. Fraud, embezzlement, tax evasion, the list went on. each accusation chipping away at the empire Jake had worked so ruthlessly to build. The prosecution wasted no time presenting the evidence. The frozen accounts, falsified property records, and damning testimonies from former associates painted a picture of a man consumed by greed and power. The press covered every moment, splashing Jake's disgraced image across headlines and ensuring his reputation would never recover. As the verdict was read, guilty on all counts, Jake slumped in his seat. The reality of his fate was undeniable. Years behind bars, his assets seized, his name permanently tarnished. The gavel came down, a final punctuation to the life he once knew. Across town, Olivia sat in the dim confines of a quiet cafe, the weight of her own choices pressing heavily on her shoulders. The scandal surrounding Jake had left her isolated, her social circle evaporating as quickly as Jake's fortune. The people she once considered friends now avoided her, unwilling to be associated with the fallout. Her days were a blur of regret and self-recrimination. She had believed Jake's promises, fallen for his charm, and betrayed the man who had stood by her side. Now she was alone, haunted by the knowledge that she had been nothing more than a pawn in Jake's schemes. One afternoon, as she scrolled through the latest articles on Jake's trial, Olivia found herself staring at Ethan's number on her phone. She had called him countless times, leaving voicemails filled with apologies and pleas for forgiveness. Each time the response was the same, silence. She dialed again, her voice trembling as she left yet another message. "Ethan, I don't know if you'll ever listen to this, but I'm so sorry. I see now what I did, how I hurt you. I don't expect forgiveness, but I need you to know how much I regret everything." As she hung up, tears streamed down her face. But deep down she knew the truth. Ethan had moved on, and there was no undoing the damage she had caused. Ethan, meanwhile, was focused on rebuilding his life. The satisfaction of seeing Jake brought to justice was a small victory, but it wasn't enough to heal the wounds of betrayal. He had spent weeks reflecting on the choices that had led him to this point, determined to find a path forward. One of the first steps he took was reconnecting with the people who had supported him through the ordeal. His siblings, Tommy and Rachel, had been instrumental in exposing Jake's schemes, and their bond had only grown stronger in the process. At a family dinner, Tommy raised a glass, his voice steady and filled with gratitude. "To Ethan for showing us what resilience looks like. And to Rachel for being the smartest person in the room as always." Rachel smirked, her eyes twinkling with humor. "And to Tommy for finally getting his act together." Laughter filled the room, a sound that had been absent for far too long. For the first time in months, Ethan felt a sense of peace, surrounded by the people who truly mattered. But Ethan's journey didn't end there. The experience had left him with a newfound sense of purpose. He began volunteering at a local support group for individuals who had faced betrayal and emotional abuse. Sharing his story wasn't easy, but it was cathartic, and he found solace in helping others navigate their own pain. One evening, after a particularly emotional session, a woman approached him. Her eyes were filled with tears, but her voice was steady. "Thank you," she said. "Hearing your story, it gave me hope. I've been struggling to find a way forward, and you reminded me that it's possible." Ethan smiled, humbled by her words. "It is possible," he said. "It's not easy, but it's worth it." As the months passed, Ethan's life began to take on a new shape. He found joy in the small things again. A sunrise walk along the beach, a quiet evening with a good book, a simple conversation with a stranger. The pain of the past didn't disappear, but it no longer defined him. One evening, as he sat on his balcony overlooking the city, Ethan reflected on the lessons he had learned. Betrayal had taught him about the fragility of trust, but it had also shown him the strength of resilience. He had lost so much, but he had gained something far more valuable: clarity. Ethan's thoughts were interrupted by the buzz of his phone. Another call from Olivia. He stared at the screen for a moment before silencing it, a quiet smile on his lips. He no longer needed her apologies or explanations. He had found his closure, and he was ready to leave the past where it belonged. Life is full of challenges, and betrayal can feel like the end of the world. But as Ethan's story shows, it's also an opportunity for growth, resilience, and rediscovery. If you've faced betrayal, know that you're not alone, and that healing is possible. Share your thoughts or your own story in the comments below. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories of justice, redemption, and the strength of the human spirit. Because no matter how dark the night, the dawn always comes.